For the first time in more than 50 years, human beings are going back to the moon. Not as passengers on a single government rocket built by a single government contractor, but as explorers riding competing commercial landers built by two of the most ambitious private space companies in history. One of them is SpaceX, the company that already dominates global launch markets, that has caught a 23-story rocket booster out of the sky with mechanical arms, and that has been building its lunar lander for 5 years. The other is Blue Origin, founded by the world's second richest man, slower and quieter than its competitor, but holding a freshly awarded NASA contract and a fundamentally different design philosophy. Both have promised NASA they will be ready. Both have everything to prove. And right now, in May 2026, neither of them has ever landed anything on the moon. The story of how two private American companies ended up in a race to put humans on the moon begins with a decision NASA made in April 2021 that shook the entire aerospace industry. The agency had been running a competition to select a commercial human landing system, the vehicle that would carry two astronauts from lunar orbit to the surface and back as part of its Artemis program. 3 companies submitted designs. Dynetics proposed a low-profile, wide-body vehicle. Blue Origin led a so-called national team, a coalition that included Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Draper Laboratory, pitching a multi-stage lander they called the Integrated Lander Vehicle. SpaceX submitted a modified version of its Starship upper stage, adapted for lunar operations. NASA evaluated all 3 on technical merit, managerial ability, and price. It selected only SpaceX, a single award, a single lander, a $2.89 billion contract that immediately set off a firestorm. Blue Origin filed a formal protest with the Government Accountability Office, arguing that NASA had changed the rules midway through the competition and that SpaceX's Starship was technically unproven. The GAO rejected the protest. Blue Origin then filed a lawsuit in federal court, seeking an injunction to halt NASA's work with SpaceX while the litigation played out. The lawsuit was widely criticized within the space community as an attempt to use legal process to win a competition that had been lost on merit. The federal court dismissed the case in November 2021. NASA was free to proceed with SpaceX, but the fight had consumed months and created a level of institutional tension between the two companies that colored everything that followed. NASA eventually came to the conclusion that relying on a single commercial lander was a strategic risk it was not willing to accept. In May 2023, the agency awarded Blue Origin a separate human landing system contract worth $3.4 billion, selecting the company's Blue Moon Mk2 lander as a second provider. The stated rationale was to increase competition, reduce costs to taxpayers, support a regular cadence of lunar landings, and further invest in the lunar economy. The original plan designated SpaceX to fly the first 2 crewed lunar landings, Artemis III and Artemis Thor, and Blue Origin to take over with Artemis V and beyond. But the Artemis program's relentless schedule delays have since scrambled that neat division of labor, and the situation in 2026 is considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. On February 27, 2026, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman confirmed a fundamental revision to the Artemis III mission. The mission that was once supposed to land 2 astronauts at the moon's south polar region for a week of surface exploration has been redesigned into a crewed test of both lunar landers in Earth orbit. Artemis III, targeting a late 2027 launch, will see the Orion spacecraft rendezvous and dock with SpaceX's Starship HLS and potentially Blue Origin's lander in low Earth orbit, validating the docking interfaces, life support connections, and crew transfer procedures that will be critical for any actual landing attempt. The first crewed lunar landing has been formally moved to Artemis IV, now scheduled for early 2028, and in a move that no one had anticipated a year ago, that landing mission is now a competition. NASA has opened the door to using either SpaceX's Starship HLS or a Blue Origin lander for the first boot on the moon moment, depending entirely on which vehicle is ready first. On April 27, 2026, Isaacman appeared before the House Appropriations Committee and confirmed the state of play with unusual directness. He said he had received responses from both SpaceX and Blue Origin, assuring him of their efforts to be ready for a late 2027 rendezvous docking test and an interoperability demonstration of both landers in advance of a landing attempt in 2028. Neither company has guaranteed the honor of the first crewed lunar landing. The mission that carries human beings back to the surface of the moon, the mission that will be remembered the way Apollo 11 is remembered, will go to whichever company finishes its certification work on time. And right now, that competition is genuinely open. SpaceX is the incumbent. It has been working on the Starship human landing system since winning its initial design study award in May 2020. The vehicle is a modified version of Starship's upper stage, redesigned for the extreme environment of lunar operations. Because the moon has no atmosphere, the heat shield and aerodynamic control surfaces that a standard Starship needs for Earth re-entry are removed. What remains is a towering structure, approximately 172 feet tall, powered by Raptor vacuum engines, equipped with a solar array on its nose section, and featuring a side-mounted elevator platform that will lower astronauts from the hatch level down to the lunar surface. The interior has been configured as a combined crew cabin and airlock. SpaceX has been building and testing elements of this vehicle for years. As of late 2025, the company had hit 49 of its NASA-contracted development milestones, including demonstrations of the life support system, thermal control, the docking interface, and the landing propulsion system. It has begun constructing a flight-capable HLS cabin with functional systems for testing and crew training. The total contract value stands at $4.5 billion, of which approximately $2.7 billion has already been paid out as milestones were reached. But SpaceX's path to the moon runs directly through Starship's general test campaign, and that test campaign has been one of the most costly and difficult engineering programs in the history of commercial spaceflight. Before any version of Starship can be human-rated for a lunar mission, the base vehicle must demonstrate reliable orbital performance. Flight 7 lost the upper stage to a propellant leak and fire. Flight 8 triggered an FAA investigation. Flight 9 lost another upper stage during the coast phase when propellant system failures caused loss of attitude control. The Block 3, the version 3 design that SpaceX needs to prove reliable before building HLS on top of it, has not yet completed a successful orbital flight with its upper stage intact. Booster 19 recently completed its static fire campaign at Pad 2, and the next Starship flight, targeting the first V3 upper stage orbital attempt, is being called one of the most high-stakes moments in the entire program. If it succeeds, SpaceX's HLS timeline accelerates dramatically. If it fails again, the window for 2028 begins to look dangerously narrow. The most technically demanding requirement of the Starship HLS architecture has not yet been demonstrated at any scale that satisfies NASA's human rating requirements. That requirement is orbital propellant transfer. The plan for getting a Starship HLS to the moon involves launching it into Earth orbit on its own Starship launch vehicle, then docking it with a series of Starship tanker spacecraft that deliver liquid oxygen and methane propellant to refuel the HLS before it departs for the moon. Multiple tanker flights are required per lunar mission. Current estimates suggest somewhere between 8 and 16 tankers depending on the transfer efficiency achieved. Transferring cryogenic propellants, liquids that must be kept at temperatures approaching minus 300 degrees Fahrenheit, between two spacecraft in orbit is an engineering challenge that no one has successfully demonstrated before. SpaceX had planned to begin its propellant transfer test campaign in early 2025. That demonstration is now expected sometime in 2026. Until it happens, the HLS cannot be certified for crew operations, regardless of how well every other element of the system performs. Blue Origin arrives at this competition with a very different history, a very different lander design, and a set of challenges that are in some ways simpler, and in others equally daunting. The Blue Moon Mk2, the crew-capable lander originally contracted for Artemis V, is a more conventional design than SpaceX's. Rather than adapting a mega-rocket upper stage into a lunar vehicle, Blue Origin designed Blue Moon from the ground up as a dedicated lander, a two-stage vehicle with a descent element that carries the crew down to the surface and an ascent element that returns them to lunar orbit. This architecture is more similar to the Apollo lunar module that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin flew to the surface of the moon in 1969 than anything SpaceX is building. It does not require orbital propellant transfer at anything like the scale Starship demands. The descent stage carries propellant loaded before departure, and the ascent stage has its own independent propulsion for the return trip. The challenge for Blue Origin is that the Mark II is almost certainly too large and too far from flight readiness to be used for an early 2028 lunar landing. Reporting from multiple sources indicated that delivering Blue Moon Mark II before the 2030s was not realistic within the existing program timeline. What has emerged instead is a plan that involves a crew-capable variant of the much smaller Blue Moon Mark I, tentatively called the Mark 1.5, that could be produced on a faster schedule and potentially meet a 2028 landing window. Details on the Mark 1.5 remain limited, as Blue Origin is characteristically reserved about sharing program information publicly. But NASA Administrator Isaacman confirmed in early 2026 that Blue Origin has been proposing revised landing architectures and that the agency is evaluating them seriously. What Blue Origin does have is operational hardware further along than its critics acknowledge. The Blue Moon Mark I robotic cargo lander, the uncrewed version that will demonstrate the vehicle's ability to navigate, descend, and touch down on the lunar surface without a crew aboard, has been completing vacuum chamber testing at NASA's Johnson Space Center. Blue Origin has proposed a Pathfinder mission, an uncrewed Mark I landing on the moon, potentially as early as 2026. If that mission succeeds, it would provide critical lunar landing data, validate the navigation and propulsion systems, and give NASA confidence that a crewed version could follow within the Artemis timeline. The Mark I lander does not require the New Glenn rocket's maximum capability. It can be launched on a single New Glenn flight, and New Glenn has now completed 2 successful launches, including the delivery of NASA's first commercial payload to orbit, which gave Blue Origin a data set it did not previously have. The New Glenn rocket itself is a critical part of this picture. Unlike SpaceX, which will use Starship to launch Starship HLS, Blue Origin uses New Glenn as its primary launch vehicle for Blue Moon. New Glenn is a large, capable rocket with a 7-meter diameter fairing and a reusable first-stage booster, but it has only flown twice, and its launch cadence and reliability database are still extremely thin compared with Falcon 9's more than 300 flights. Qualifying New Glenn for human-related lunar missions, even for the lander launch rather than the crew launch, requires a flight history that simply does not yet exist. Blue Origin will need to fly New Glenn repeatedly and successfully in the months ahead to build the confidence that NASA and its own safety boards will require before certifying the lander stack for crew use. The competition between these two companies extends beyond their lander designs into a broader battle over mission architecture. SpaceX has been vocal about proposing a simplified mission approach, one that, in its telling, could result in a faster return to the moon while simultaneously improving crew safety. The company submitted its revised architecture to NASA in late 2025 and has been formally assessing whether it can be incorporated into the current timeline. The simplified approach appears to involve reducing the number of tanker flights required for the initial lunar mission by optimizing the refueling sequence and potentially accepting a lower payload capacity for the first crewed landing. Blue Origin, meanwhile, has submitted its own architecture revisions. NASA confirmed in early 2026 that it would extend a request for proposals to the broader industry once the relevant reviews were complete, and that a group of subject matter experts would evaluate all revised concepts. The agency is not locked into either company's preferred approach. It is locked into the outcome: boots on the moon in 2028. The technical and competitive dimensions of this race sit inside a geopolitical context that makes the outcome matter beyond any corporate rivalry or engineering achievement. China's space program has been advancing with a speed and ambition that senior American officials have described in terms ranging from competitive concern to genuine alarm. The China National Space Administration has successfully returned. Samples from the lunar far side landed multiple robotic explorers and published plans for crewed lunar missions targeting the late 2020s and early 2030s. Chinese space officials have explicitly stated the goal of establishing a permanent research station at the lunar South Pole before the end of the decade, the same region where NASA's Artemis astronauts are targeting their landing. The strategic significance of that target is not accidental. The lunar South Pole is believed to contain billions of tons of water ice in permanently shadowed craters. Water ice can be broken down into hydrogen and oxygen, rocket propellant, making whoever establishes a sustainable presence at the South Pole the dominant power in the future economy of cislunar space. Isaacman has made this argument to Congress, repeatedly saying that with credible competition from America's greatest geopolitical adversary increasing by the day, the United States must move faster and meet its objectives. The irony is that both SpaceX and Blue Origin need each other to succeed, even as they compete intensely. NASA's decision to maintain 2 human landing system providers was not purely motivated by competition for its own sake. It was motivated by the recognition that having 2 dissimilar landers, built on different architectures, launched on different rockets, using different propellant combinations and different docking interfaces, creates redundancy and resilience in the lunar transportation system that a single provider cannot offer. If SpaceX encounters a hardware failure or another vehicle loss in its test campaign in the months ahead, Blue Origin's lander provides an alternative path. If Blue Moon's development slips further, Starship HLS carries the mission forward. The NASA approach, described by space policy expert Scott Pace as wisely looking to create more options in the lunar architecture, is simultaneously a competitive pressure on both companies and a safety net for the program. For the 2 astronauts whose names have not yet been announced, the crew that will board Orion atop a Space Launch System rocket and fly to the moon for the first time since 1972, and then transfer to whichever lander is waiting for them in orbit, and then ride that lander down to the surface of the moon. The question of who built their lander will matter far less than whether it works. They will train for both vehicles, they will certify on both systems, and when the moment comes, they will board whichever vehicle NASA has determined is safest, most ready, and most capable of bringing them to the surface and back. The first person to descend that elevator platform and plant a boot on the lunar regolith at the South Pole of the moon will not be thinking about which company won the contract. They will be thinking about the view. But for the engineers in Hawthorne and in Kent, Washington, who have spent years building these machines, For the propulsion teams, debugging Raptor engine anomalies at 3 in the morning, and the structural analysts poring over blue moons, descent stage weight margins, the competition is intensely real. It is measured in milestone completions, in static fire results, in propellant transfer demonstrations, in certification reviews passed or failed. Every month that passes without a successful orbital flight of Starship V3 is a month that Blue Origin closes the gap. Every successful New Glenn launch gives Blue Origin's lander program a foundation it did not have the week before. And somewhere in the machinery of NASA's review boards and contractor program offices, a decision is slowly taking shape about which vehicle gets the call for the mission that will define the decade. There is one more dimension to this competition that rarely surfaces in the technical coverage, but matters enormously to anyone trying to understand the full picture. The Axiom space. Axiom-U spacesuit, the lunar surface suit that astronauts will wear when they step out onto the moon for the first time since 1972, is being developed under a separate NASA contract and has not yet completed human rating certification. Axiom confirmed in April 2026 that it was working toward a test flight of the Axiom-U in 2027, but had not determined the specific mission or platform for that test. A spacesuit that is not certified for the lunar environment cannot be worn during a lunar surface EVA. That means even if both landers are ready on time, even if the Artemis IV crew successfully transfers from Orion to the lander in lunar orbit, the ability to actually walk on the moon depends on a third contractor hitting its own independent schedule. The complexity of making all three of these systems, the lander, the rocket, and the suit, ready simultaneously in a program that has repeatedly struggled to keep any one of them on schedule, is the real engineering challenge underneath the competitive narrative. SpaceX has the experience, the infrastructure, the flight history, and the financial firepower of a company that just filed for a $2 trillion IPO. Blue Origin has a dedicated lander design, a less technically complex refueling requirement, and a founder whose patience and personal wealth have underwritten the program through years of quiet development. Both have been told by NASA that 2028 is the target. Both have said they will be ready. History suggests that in programs of this complexity, what people say and what happens are not always the same thing. But the machinery is moving, the hardware is being built, the clock is running, and the moon is waiting for whichever team gets there first.